Welcome! In this series of short videos, we will look at topics for the PowerBasic Windows Compiler. Today we will look at using the Windows Form Designer. In contrast with the console compiler, the PowerBasic Windows Compiler is specifically designed to allow you to create graphical user interface applications. Creating a graphical user interface can be more complex, as there is more to think about and for the user to interact with. However, PowerBasic for Windows does ship with dynamic dialog tools. DDT is integral to the design of PowerBasic for Windows, and it allows you to create many objects on Windows which the user can interact with. Dynamic dialog tool commands can all be accessed by using a number of PowerBasic commands. However, as there are a great number of these commands, it can be difficult for a user to initially grasp what they can do. So what we're going to look at today is the Forms Designer. Forms is a separate application and builds in quite nicely to the PowerBasic IDE we covered in the last course video. The addition of the Forms Designer allows you to graphically create the form on screen. And then once saved, this will save all the commands into the code of your application, where you can further develop them or pop back into the Forms Designer to add more controls. So let's go and look at how we create our first Form Designer application. If we create a basic application first of all, and we will save this to our disk, and we will call this Form Demo. So this is our Windows application. Now we want to design a form which we can actually use within this application. If we go up to the Tools menu, you'll see there's an entry for PowerBasic Forms. If we click on that, and there is a shortcut of the F7 button, it brings up the Forms Designer. A pop-up has appeared on screen to say that the selected file was not initially created by PowerBasic Forms. We can import this file into our designer, and it tells us there are no objects to import. So we click on the very first icon on the toolbar, which is to give us a new dialog. And here is our dialog. We'll make it a little larger. And from here on the right-hand side, you'll see there is a toolbox. This contains all the objects that we can put onto our form. So we're going to start quite simply by putting a couple of objects on this form. We have the choice of labels or text boxes. So let's put a label on. We double click, it will appear on the screen. And we can drag this around the screen quite happily until we have it where we want it. I'll make it a little bigger. And if we double click on this object, we then can change some of its properties. So we'll change the caption. And we can change the colour of our object. We'll change this to blue. And we will give it a name. It's always useful to name your objects. That way when you refer to them in code, it's much easier knowing that this is a label called title rather than calling it label 1. For the moment, we'll go with the defaults. The position and size tells us both in dialog units and in pixels. There's an important point to grasp here. When you're designing forms on screen, you can design them either having a coordinate system which is based on pixels or a coordinate system which is based on dialog units. Pixels, as the name suggests, means if you say you want it 100 pixels wide by 50 pixels high, that's exactly how it will appear on screen. And you also specify the left and top coordinates of the object. However, if your user has a high-resolution monitor, this might be quite small on the screen. Therefore, what you can do is to go for dialog units. Dialog units give you a more device-independent way of looking at the objects on screen. This will become more obvious later, but for the moment we're going to go for dialog units. So our dialog coordinate system is set here to default on this radio button to be dialog units. So we'll take that as our default. Now, having put this title on the screen, it's quite small, therefore we might want to make it slightly larger. So if we double click, and in the General tab, we have the font. The font is currently MS Sans Serif, size 8 point. So we'll make that a little larger. Let's go for 18 point. And if we OK that, we'll see our title is now much bigger. So you can make adjustments to your form in the designer, knowing that when you get into the application, this is what you're going to see. So let's now put a button on the screen. If we double click on the button icon in the toolbox, we get a button and we can then position the button on screen. We double click on it, we can then change the caption of the button. Let's change this, we'll call it exit, and the button name can have a number of different values. These are pre-built into Windows. So if we pick the ID abort, this is how it's referenced in code. You can of course put your own name in. So if we apply that and hit OK. Now we have two objects on this form, a title and a button. So let's add a third text box. And if we move that down here, we'll make it slightly bigger. And if we double click as before, we can see it has a pre-set up caption. So we will blank that one out to allow the user to key something in. And we will change the name. You can, of course, make the name anything you like, but the standard is to have them as constants with IDC at the front. That way they are more obvious in code. So if we hit OK, there is our text box. So how will it look to the user? If we click on the toolbar, you'll see there's a little switch on the toolbar called Test Dialog. If we click on that, it will show us how this form will appear on the screen. Now the title of the form is Dialog 1, so that's possibly not what we want in this particular case, and also we don't have an X at the top right hand corner or a maximize or a minimize button. So let's exit the test mode, clicking the exit test mode button, and we will look to put those objects on screen. If we double click on the form, we can change the caption. So we've now put a caption in for the dialog, and in the styles, we want to put in a tick against the minimize and maximize, and we'll tick the sys menu and the caption. If we OK that, we will see these widgets now appear at the top right hand corner. If we click on our test once more, we can see they appear on screen, and if we click on them, it will close the form. So we can test our dialog inside the Forms Designer. And when we're happy with that, we can then click the Save button. It will ask us where we want to save this particular form. Now I'm going to overwrite the form demo and click Save. It will say it already exists, where we'll click on Yes. And once it's saved the form, we can exit out the Form Designer. So it's now saved the form. So if we exit out the Form Designer, it will tell us that the file has been modified outside the integrated development environment. If we click on Yes to reload it, we will see we now have code appearing on our screen. This is all the code that the Forms Designer has put in for you. At the beginning of the application, we can see we have a resource command and 3 include files: the Windows API, a common control include file, and a PB Forms include file. These are all encapsulated inside these 2 lines of code, a PB Forms begin and a PB Forms end. Anything between these 2 brown lines of code on screen is under the control of the Forms Designer. so it's best not to put any of your own code within this block. If we look further down, we'll see there are some constants which PBForms has created. One for the dialog, one for the label which is title, one for our button which is an abort button, and one for the text box. These are unique numbers used to specify the object within the rest of the code. It has also declared a couple of functions, one to show dialog1 and one as a callback function, an event handler. We'll cover these later. If we look further down in the PBMain function, the PBMain function, as we specified in the last video, is the very first function that is called when your application runs. So there's a function here called PBForms initialize common controls. This runs before your dialog. And in here we have show dialog1. Leaving the dialog called dialog1 is probably not the best idea, because we're not sure what dialog1 actually does, and your application may have many dialogs. So let's go back into the Forms Designer and change that. Here it's now telling you there are a number of objects to bring in, so we'll click OK, and there is our dialog, as it was before. If we double click, we can change the name of the dialog to anything we like. So let's call it DLG. So we will call this dialog Get Title, and the caption which should appear at the top is Enter the Title. So we hit Apply, OK that, we'll save this once more, and once it is saved we'll go back to our code and reload it, and our code is now reloaded. So if we look back at the beginning, we will see our dialog has now changed its name to Dialog Get Title. These two declarations have not changed, so I'm going to take these out, because in the current version of PowerBasic for Windows, we don't need to pre-declare our functions. Now, as we've renamed our dialog, we'll need to change this in here if we want this function name to change as well. So we'll change that to show title. And we will change everything else to match. This is why it's always best in the Forms Designer to get the name of things correct at the first go. So let's go back to the beginning of the code and look at it once more. So we are creating a compilation which is going to end up giving us an executable. PBForms has included a number of necessary files in order to run our dialog. It's also created constants for each of the objects on that dialog. And in our PBMain, we are calling the function to show the title dialog. And here is our callback function. The callback function is basically an event handler. We'll cover that in a moment. If we hit the F2 button, we'll see there are two entries for PBMain, which does at first seem a little odd, but we have an entry for show title and one for the callback function, the event handler. If we look at the PBMain first of all, we'll see at the end of the code there's a PBForms copy. This is the copy of the code before we did the importing. This is just in case that if you have existing code in your application and you have designed your form after that fact. In this case, we're not interested in this particular code, so we can just remove it from the bottom of the code. Now, if we have a look at what's left, we can see the show title function. This show title function is what will draw the dialog on screen. So let's step through this slowly to see what it's actually doing. As you can see, there is another PBForms brown line of code saying begin dialog. This is a block of code which PBForms maintains for you, so any changes you make will be reflected in here. So if you want to put any additional code to change things on the form, it should be done outside this block, i.e. in here. So let's look at this block of code that PB Forms has actually created for you. It's created a couple of local variables. A handle for the dialog. Every time you create a dialog, it's given a Windows handle. This allows you to do things on the dialog by specifying that handle. You also need this handle for changing anything on any of the controls on the dialog. Since we changed the font we used on the dialog, it's created automatically a handle for that font. The next line of code is quite a long one. This is where the dialog is newly created. We're using the words dialog new and the parent. In this case, the parent is a parameter that's been passed into this function. If we go back to the beginning of the code where this function was called, we'll see the parameter that was passed is the handle of the desktop. The handle of the desktop is passed as the parent of our dialog is the desktop itself, which has a value of 0. These handles are quite useful as when you create an application with many dialogs, one dialog may call another dialog, and that dialog may call a third or fourth dialog as well. This is used so that you can navigate through your dialogs. So in the rest of this command are the details to control the dialog itself. The title of the dialog, the position on screen, the width and height of the dialog. These are all in dialog units. And then some parameters. If we look, we have WS pop-up, border, dialog frame, caption, sysmenu, minimize box, maximize box, and so on. These are all the properties we ticked in the Form Designer. It's much easier creating all of this in the Form Designer than typing this manually. Although if you wish, you can type all these commands manually and not use the Form Designer. If we look further down, we'll see there are a number of control commands. One to add a label, one to set the colour of that label, in this case we're going for foreground blue, one to add a button, and one to add a text box. In each case, the location and size of the object is specified in here as dialog units. And further down the code is a command to create a new font. As you will remember, we created an MS Sans Serif font, 18 points in size. And the output of this command is populating this variable at the end, which is the font handle. And this is referenced in this control set font. It has 3 parameters: the dialog handle, telling Windows which dialog we're talking about, the object handle, in this case the title of the label, and the font we wish to apply to that object. And further down, we have a command outside the PB Forms, which is to show the dialog modally to the user. A modal dialog is a dialog that's shown to the user and we will then wait for the user to do something. So the dialog will remain on screen until the user does something to either dismiss the dialog or enter data into it. And this is where the event handler kicks in. We're specifying the function which is the event handler. We'll get on to that in a moment, but the last part of function is once this dialog has been dismissed, we then come down here for the cleanup exercise. And there's a font end command in here which PB Forms has put in automatically. This will free up the memory used by the font when it was created. And the final command is to exit from this particular function and pass back whatever this variable is. And this variable was the value that is populated when the form was dismissed. This can be used for a number of things. Say for example we had two buttons on our form, one to say OK and one to say cancel. We can pass the values of this back to the calling routine. This would allow our application to realise which button the user had pressed quite easily. But before we get into that kind of detail, let's go and have a look at the callback function, the event handler. If we hit the F2 on the screen, we will get this code finder coming up. This will allow us to go in and click on the callback function, the event handler itself. In here, the name of the function is preceded by the word callback, which indicates to PowerBasic that it is indeed a callback function. And this handles all the events where something has happened on the dialog. There is a section called Initialize Dialog. The callback function is split up into these different sections. The initial dialog is the very first thing that's called when the dialog is about to be shown to the user, and happens before the dialog is shown to the user. This allows you to set values on screen or perform any computation you feel necessary before the user starts to interact with the form. The next section in here, NC Activate, is put in automatically by the form's designer to handle when the form loses focus and regains focus. Normally, you don't have to change this section. The section next, which is of greatest importance to you, is the command section. In here, this will handle any process control notifications. As you will see, is put in an entry for the ID abort, which, as you will remember, was the handle of the button on the screen. We labelled our button Exit. So what this will do is we can handle when the user clicks on that button by testing the control message. Does it equal button clicked, or does it equal the value 1? If that's the case, then we can execute this line of code. At the moment, this only pops up a message box on screen. We can, of course, do anything we wish in this line of code. We can replace this call to a message box to any functionality you need to get done. As this is an exit button, what I'm going to put in here is something to close the dialog down. I'm going to use a dialog end command. And as you may have many dialogues in the application, we'll need to tell Windows which dialog we wish to close. So we can use this construct. You'll see this a lot. CB stands for callback. So this particular object has a handle. So we're saying that we wish to end the current dialog, and here is the handle of it. In this select statement, we're handling the control that's been clicked on of the current dialog, we're handling the control's message it's passed back, and we're closing the dialog. So if we try running our application now, our dialog appears on screen, and we can put some data into the text box. And if we wish to interact further with the dialog, we can hover over and then click the exit button. As we saw in the event handler, the callback function, if we click on this button, it should close the dialog, which it does indeed do. When the dialog is closed, it will go back to the PB main function, which is where the dialog was initially called from. And as there is no line of code after this, the entire application will end, because we've got to the end of the PB main function. So in summary, what we've done today is we've used the PowerBasic Forms Designer to create a dialog from scratch. Using this GUI method of creating a dialog allows the Forms Designer to create a great deal of code for you and save you a considerable amount of time. It also means that should you wish to add additional objects to this form, you can pop back into the Forms Designer and add them there. This will slot them into the appropriate places in your code. And then you can add extra functionality for what you want to do when the user interacts with those controls on screen. This has been a short introduction to the PowerBasic Forms Designer. We'll cover more in the next video, but that's it for today. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching today's video. Please feel free to click on the link in the description below to discover more videos.